Viz22 here. Before we begin, be warned that this story is not for the faint of heart or the weak-stomached. There are some very disturbing scenes depicted throughout this story, the most gruesome being at the very beginning involving an infant. So if you are not one for this type of horror, that is alright. A new, tamer video will be coming soon. But for those who stick around after this warning and then complain to me about the video's content, I don't know what to tell you. Anyway, on to the story. "Just the cutest," my grandmother exclaimed in a bubbly tone as she booped the baby's nose. My aunt had just given birth, a baby boy. He squirmed around on the table, his back rubbing against the soft blanket. He swirled his tongue around, his eyes full of wonder as they darted around. My whole family loomed above him. My aunt, June, looked down at him with proud eyes. Her husband, my uncle, Luke, almost shed a tear. My grandma, Mary, had this smile on her face, almost devilish. My grandpa, Danny, right next to her, like two peas in a pod. My mother stood next to me, her hands on my shoulders, my father standing behind her. I watched uncomfortably as they rubbed their hands across all the baby's body, admiring his soft skin. My throat slowly started knotting up. I jumped in my seat, my eyes twitching as my grandma raised up a shining blade and swung it down into the child's face. My neck cranked at the feeling of blood splashing against my cheek. The knife went completely through its head. The tip of the blade pressed into the wooden table. My grandma pulled the knife out, blood dripping off. I looked around at everyone. They were drooling over its corpse. My grandma slowly slid her tongue against the blade, licking off a sliver of blood. She pulled her tongue back into her mouth, her eyes rolling into the back of her head. "Sweet youth," she moaned, a grin on her face. "Dig in," my aunt chirped. My family knocked into my shoulders, rushing towards the body. They raised their knives and began slicing off limbs. Blood squirted across the table as they dismembered arms, flesh and muscle stretching as it severed. I watched my grandma sink her teeth into the severed arm, blood trickling down her chin. She chewed slowly, savoring each bite. Her hair slowly began changing, the gray strands almost instantly changing to a grayish brown. Her wrinkly skin grew tighter and smoother. She looked like she had gone from 75 to 55. My grandpa tore a leg off, blood pouring down the table. He sunk his teeth into it like corn, pulling on strands of skin. And just like grandma, his frizzy gray hair began to transform colors, reverting to grayish blonde, bald spots filled in with clumps of hair. His skin smoothed out. My mother and father didn't need very much, so they picked lightly. My mother reached over with a fork and picked one of the eyeballs, tucking it off of meaty strings. She observed the small, shiny eyeball and then plopped it in her mouth like a piece of gum. My father took the other eyeball, blood squirting out of the empty socket and dripping down the side of its face. My uncle reached over with his knife and opened the baby's mouth and yanked its tongue out of its mouth and began slicing it off with the knife. Blood filled its mouth and squirted down its neck as my uncle chewed on the tongue like fat from steak. They continued to pick it apart, taking any limb or organ that fulfilled their insatiable desire. They began to slice it open after taking most of the outside. They slid down its stomach and pried its corpse open. "These are the goods. Like a piñata," my aunt joked as they dug their hands around its organs. They pulled out stringy intestines, slurping on them like sausages, and my grandma went right for the gold, tearing out its small heart. She raised it above her mouth, tilting her head back. She clenched the heart tightly, blood pouring down her mouth and to the sides of her face. My family cheered her on, as if she were chugging a beer at a frat party. She juiced out every last drop, licking excess blood off her lips. She then devoured the rest of the heart until there was no more. My uncle bit off pieces of lung like a pork chop. I watched as my family ravaged the corpse, blood smearing everywhere. I began to think about my siblings. I knew I had 3 of them, but I only remember one. I only ever met one. I don't even remember his name. I just remember playing with him one day and he was gone the next. My train of thought broke when I noticed a head in front of me. My uncle dangled his head in front of me, soaked in blood. Between his fingertips, a small toe with a nail ripped off. I looked up at him, my eyes shaking. He had this soft, encouraging look on his face. It was disturbing. I couldn't push the words out. So my mother interjected. "Oh, please, she doesn't need that," she chuckled. "Be grateful for that one," my uncle said, dropping the toe in his mouth. By the time they were done, the body had been picked clean. The only things left were bones and pieces of meat to save for later. I eyed the carcass, and it looked like it was attacked by rabid dogs. I looked around at my family. My grandpa and grandma looked young enough to be parents, and my aunt and uncle could pass as my older siblings. "Maria, honey, why don't you go to bed?" my mother said quietly, kissing the top of my head. I stood up, leaving the table, as my family bantered. I walked upstairs, the old stairs creaking as my feet hit each one. I went to the bathroom, quickly sliding in and shutting the door behind me. I turned the light on, and the room illuminating. I looked at myself in the mirror, my big brown eyes staring back at me. I scraped off the dried blood that splashed on my tan skin. I felt like crying. Why did I feel like crying? I've seen it before. It doesn't really get any easier. I understand, but do I? There was no point in questioning it. It was just one of those things. I should be grateful that they didn't choose me, that my parents chose parenthood over youth. I left the bathroom. Walking back to my room, I slowed my pace down when I heard the faint sound of grainy breathing. I looked around the dark hallway. I looked at the door next to me. The sound was coming from behind it. And then I remembered. My great-grandma Lorraine. She's been on the brink of death since the 90s. They always intended to involve her in the feast every time, but they get selfish and end up barely giving her scraps. Being in old age for over a decade has crippled her. She sits in her room and never leaves. They bring up slices of skin and chunks of meat on a plate like a dog. I know they don't care about her, only about the bloodline. I entered my room and plopped onto my bed, my body sinking into the cold, soft mattress as I drifted off to sleep. I wake up suddenly, startled by the sound of arguing. I open my eyes slowly, and my eyeballs feeling dry. I slowly sat up, still a bit dazed. I overheard a loud conversation. "It's not fucking working anymore," my grandpa exclaimed, his voice muffled to the floors. "Did she eat any at all?" my uncle asked. "Yes, and it didn't do anything," my grandpa answered. "Does it ever do anything?" my mom snarled. "Don't be fucking stupid. It's kept her barely alive for years. Why isn't it working?" His rage grew, followed by a bang against a table. "Calm down. Why didn't you save more?" my dad chimed in. "Why didn't you save more? Why didn't any of you save more?" he barked back. "Please just shut up. She's been alive for this long. She can go a little longer without," my aunt groaned. I knew they were talking about my great-grandma. I guess they got a little too selfish this time. She can't die. She's my mother, for Christ's sake," he shouted. "We'll figure something out," my mom suddenly interjected. They stayed silent for a moment, my ears wide open. "The girl," my grandma suddenly proposed. "What?" my grandpa asked, annoyed. "Maria, she's young enough. Good amount of meat on those bones," her creaky voice explained. My body went numb as the words flowed through my ears. It couldn't have been serious. No, we made a deal, my mom growled, her voice beginning to shake. We did it with the others. She'll understand. We're family. My grandma tried to convince her. Fuck that. She's family. My daughter, you fucking hag. Don't ever try that again. My mom attacked. I flinched at the sound of a smack that rang through the floorboards. We brought you into this family. You are where you are today because of us. My grandma hissed. There was silence for a moment. We did it with the others previously. This is just how it has to be, my uncle reassured her. I'm not doing this. Touch her and I'll fucking eat you instead, my mom declared, the sound of pounding footsteps following. We'll get her in a few hours. It'll have to be a bit of a surprise. She won't cooperate, my grandma planned. My heart dropped into my stomach. I needed to make a move, now. I threw my blanket off of myself and hopped out of bed. I stepped onto the floor, squinting my eyes after realizing I might have stomped too hard, praying it wasn't loud. No other noises followed, so I started throwing around ideas in my head. I tried to map out the layout of my house in my head. 6 family members looking for me. My brain scrambled when I heard the sounds of multiple footsteps. I quietly opened my door, sliding out of my room quickly. I observed the long hallway, and no one was in sight. My house is pretty much a mansion, a courtesy of my great-grandmother's fortune. I slowly walked down the hall, my socks sinking into the old carpet. I heard muffled whispers beneath the floor. My best bet would be to sneak down the stairs and bolt out the front door. I crept closer to the staircase, trying not to alert anybody of my presence. Suddenly, my aunt turned the corner as she reached the top step. I froze in place, my heart racing. She turned to look at me, silent for a moment. A grin grew on her face. Maria, there you are. Could you please come downstairs and help with the cleanup? Your poor Aunt June's back is taking a toll. She let out a try-hard giggle. I thought for a moment, trying to plan my next move. Then I realized, they don't know that I know. I straightened my posture, closing my widened eyes, but my guard was still up. Sure. Could I go to the bathroom quickly? I asked. Yeah, actually, could I come in with you quickly? Gotta grab some ibuprofen. She smiled, tilting her head to the side. Bitch. I nodded and walked over to the bathroom. She wouldn't walk next to me, only ominously behind me. I looked out of the corners of my eyes as I entered the bathroom. I'll grab it quickly and be out of your hair. She approached the medicine cabinet. Stupidly, I let my eyes off of her when I looked down at the toilet, noticing the creaking pipes. All of a sudden, I felt hands push me over with full force. I yelped as I slipped on the tile floor, trying to grab the toilet to regain balance. My hands slipped as well. My forehead crashed into the side of the bathtub. The impact rippled through my head. Blood began to trickle down my face. I slowly opened my shaking eyes, my vision blurry. Just make this easy, she groaned as I felt her kneel behind me. She balled a clump of hair in her fist and pulled my head back. I looked up, blood sliding past my eye. Just a sliver, and some more. Her mouth stretched into a sinister smile as I saw a knife go towards my arm. Still dizzy from the hit, I used all my strength I had and swung my elbow, knocking into her nose. She fell off of me, on her knees, leaning over the tub next to me. I stood up, almost falling backwards. I blinked tightly a few times, trying to clear my vision. I looked down, and she was covering her nose with her 2 hands, the knife on the floor next to her. It was too risky. She released her hands, placing them on the lining of the tub to help her get up. Before she could lift herself up, I raised my leg and dropped my foot on top of her head. Her head crashed down, her mouth ricocheting against the lining. A knocked-out tooth sliding into the tub. I quickly whipped around and dashed out of the room. I ran for my life down the hallway, finding any room to run into. "You little cunt! Danny!" Her cries echoed out from the bathroom. I continued to run, my feet stomping, then halted harshly, almost leaving tire marks, when I hit a dead end, the only door left on this side of the floor. I looked behind me, waiting for a furious ant to come for blood. I heard quick footsteps run up the stairs. "Oh my God, what happened?" my uncle asked. I turned back around and barged into the room. I shut it behind me quietly, trying not to give away my location. I looked around the room and it was pitch black. I dragged my hands across the walls to feel for the light switch, and when I flipped the switch under my fingers, I flipped out. The room illuminated. I was in one of the dozens of living rooms, couches you weren't allowed to sit on, tables you'd get crucified for if you set a drink down on them. The room painted a light maroon, the fancy sofas a bright pink. I looked around for any windows to escape, but they were all too small to escape through. I quickly noticed the two medieval armor statues that stood like guards together at the back of the room. I walked towards them, feeling like they were going to get possessed and leap at me like in Scooby-Doo. The light reflected off of their shining silver armor, their hands clasped together, holding long swords like canes. I kneeled down, dragging my finger down the side of the blade. I raised my finger up, noticing blood coming from a paper-cut-sized incision. They're real. I noticed the blood from my head dripping off my chin. I wiped the stream of blood that ran down my face, smearing it on the back of my hand. I stood up and looked behind me at the door. I haven't heard a sound since I escaped my aunt. I looked back at the statue. Suddenly, a light bulb lit up above my head. I grabbed the statue's fingers. They were easily adjustable. I pulled them back one by one until I stepped aside as the sword dropped to the floor. I grabbed the handle with two hands and tried to lift it. "Jesus Christ," I groaned as the sword had an unexpected weight. I felt my face turn red as I tried to lift it above my head, but my arms gave out and I had to drop it to the floor. I panted as I tried to catch my breath. I could lift it at least up to my stomach. I realized how loud the sword was when I heard footsteps quickly approaching the room. My eyes widened as I began dragging the sword over to the door. I quickly ran over and turned off the lights, planting myself in front of the door, lifting up the sword and holding it like a spear. I aimed the tip towards the entryway, waiting for someone to walk. The footsteps grew closer, the pounding shaking the floor. I tightened my grip, my arms shaking, my gaze locked. The footsteps reached the doorknob slowly turning. The door flew open, light outlining the silhouette of a man standing in the hallway. "Where the fuck are?" my uncle called out. I put all of my might into it, cutting off his words as I rammed the sword through his stomach. He let out a drop of air as it escaped his lungs. His mouth dropped open. I slowly trekked closer to him, pushing against his weight as I impaled the sword deeper into him. Blood began trickling out of his mouth. A look of fear glimmered in his eyes. I pushed the sword far enough that the base of the handle prevented me from pushing any further. He looked down at me, the life leaving his eyes. He tried lifting his hand, his skin losing color. He reached for my neck, lifting his other hand as well, and before he could get a hold of me, he collapsed to the ground, the sword still inside of him. I looked down at his corpse, my chest pumping, a pool of blood forming under him. I couldn't believe I had just done that, but it oddly didn't feel bad. "No!" a voice cried out from down the hallway. I looked down the hallway. My aunt stood, a knife in her hand. Her light brown hair was frizzy, looking like a bird's nest. I could see a broken heart in her eyes as she watched me standing over her husband's body. The heartbreak quickly transitions to rage. Her jaw was shaking with anger, her mouth covered in dried blood. She slowly raised up the knife, looking bloodthirsty. I stared her back down, trying not to show fear when I was really just frozen. She broke into a sprint, letting out an ear-piercing cry as she flew down the hallway. My fight or flight kicked in, and before she could reach me, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I jumped back as the knife pierced through the door. "You little shit! I'll fucking gut you!" she screamed from behind the door, retracting the knife and stabbing it back through. I looked around for something to defend myself. I didn't have enough time or strength to grab the other sword. My time was cut off when she began kicking the door. I slowly stepped back, eyes still on the door, trying to back up as far as possible. I could tell adrenaline was running through her veins when the door gave in after 3 kicks. The door swung open, the knob crashing into the wall. She stood in the doorway, her upper body moving up and down. She was breathing like a beast. I walked around the sofas, standing behind the small glass coffee table. She began walking after me quickly. I sidestepped quickly, trying to run her in a circle around the sofas. With no defense, she caught up to me quickly, grabbing my hair before I could turn around and making a run for it. I screamed as she threw me backwards, dropping me onto the glass. The thin glass instantly shattered behind me, my back pressed against hundreds of shards. Before I could try and get myself up, she pounced on top of me like an animal. Our gazes crossed, her eyes lit with fire. "I'll savor this one," she hissed through her teeth, raising the knife up high. Her knees pressed into my stomach. I struggled to reach for a piece of glass. I stretched my arm out, but couldn't get a grip on a big piece. She swung down, my impulse reaction being to raise my hand up. I blocked the knife with my hand, the blade going through my palm. The blade pierced entirely through, the handle pressing against the wound. Not able to squeeze out a scream, the shock numbing the pain. I watched as blood trickled into my face. I quickly snatched a big chunk of glass and jabbed it into the side of her neck. The look of anger on her face dropped as blood squirted into my hand. Using all of my strength, I gripped the shard tightly and dragged it across her neck, blood pouring out as I left a rigid gash that ran across the entire front of her neck. When I reached the other side of her neck, I ripped the shard out, leaving a wound deep enough to hit her windpipe. A long cut imprinted from the glass pressed against my hand. She fell over, gargling blood in her mouth, slowly stood up, tripping on shards of glass. I looked down at her body, the youth slowly leaving her. Strands of gray hair grew back, small wrinkles forming on her skin. The pain finally hit me as I looked at my hand, the knife still stabbed through. I took a deep breath and held it as I tightly gripped the handle. I slowly pulled the knife out, the sound of metal grinding against flesh and bone. "Fuck!" I shrieked in pain as I took the knife out, tears streaming down my cheeks as I lifted up my shaking hands, blood streaming down my arms as I observed the massive hole the knife left. I had no time to cry as I heard footsteps running upstairs. They had heard my scream. I quickly ran out of the room, keeping the knife as a weapon, and down the hallway. I needed to get out of the house. Before I could turn the corner, someone quickly grabbed my hand and snatched me inside of a dark closet. I squirmed around, punching and kicking everywhere, swinging the knife around. "Who is this? I'll fucking kill you!" I threatened as I twisted and turned. Suddenly, hands grabbed my shoulders, trying to get me to stop wriggling. "Shh, it's me," my mother whispered reassuringly. I stopped moving at the reassuring sound of her voice. "Oh, thank God. Everyone's going fucking insane. I've literally killed Uncle Danny and Aunt June. Oh my God, I killed them." I panicked, the situation truly setting in. "It's okay. You did what you had to do," another voice reassured me. I realized my father was in here as well. "What are you guys doing in here?" I asked quietly. "I'm assuming you know the plan. I stormed away up here. Your father and I talked in here for privacy. When we heard the fighting, we stayed out of fear," she explained. "What do we do?" I begged for a plan. I don't know," "There's no way to make it downstairs," she added on. "I just want to get out of here," I quietly sobbed. My father stayed silent for a moment. Sounded like he was choked up. "I'm sorry. I love you. But it's for the family," he suddenly declared. "What?" I questioned confusedly. "Don't do this," my mother pleaded breathlessly. What's going on?" I began to panic. "She's in here," my father called out. My whole body sank. I felt like I was spiraling in a dream. He threw the door open and shoved me out in the hallway, dropping the knife inside of the closet. I stumbled around, falling against the wall. The sound of running came from downstairs, sounding like bulls. I regained balance and began running back to the room where my aunt and uncle laid to rest. "Stop!" my father called out to me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my entire body shaking. I slowly turned around, my cheeks soaked with tears. My father stood at the other end of the hallway, a rifle in hand, aimed at me. I froze like a deer in headlights. He kept his aim steady, his eye looking to aim. "Please, don't do this," I begged through my tears. As he was about to pull the trigger, my mother came out from the closet and lunged at him. She leaped out of the closet, slicing his waist with a knife. I jumped where I stood as the bullet just missed me, hitting the door frame behind me. He turns to my mother, a look of fury painted his face. "You stupid whore," he roared, hitting her with the stock of the rifle. She cried as she fell to the ground, blood dripping onto the carpet. He swung it up, hitting his chin and knocking her on her back. He stood over her, holding the rifle with two hands, and began bashing it into his face. No, stop," I cried out, barely able to get the words out. I watched with empty lungs as he repeatedly bashed her face in. Her nose snapped to the side, eventually caving into her face. Blood splattered across the floor, her eyeball beginning to pop out. The sight was nauseating, but I had no time to mourn. I tried running down the hall and past him, but he put a hold on bashing her face in and swung the rifle into the back of my head as I flew past him. I groaned as I tumbled to the ground, my face burning as my skin rubbed against the carpet. I felt his pounding footsteps coming towards me. I took a chance at making a hit and kicked my foot back. My timing was perfect, and my foot rammed into his ankle. "Fuck!" he groaned in frustration, and before he could stand up, I grabbed the gun from his hands and knocked him on the top of the head with it. He fell to his knees, his hands planted on the ground, blood trickling through his dark hair. I stood in front of him, the rifle in my hands. I lifted his chin up with the barrel of the rifle, looking at him in the eye. The fire in his eyes had been blown out. He looked scared now. I crammed the barrel into his mouth. He gurgled as the cold metal filled his mouth. I tilted the gun down, aiming the barrel up. He looked up at me with pleading eyes, but I barely gave it any thought as I pulled the trigger. The bullet burst through the top of his head. Blood and brain matter flew through the air. I flinched as blood in chunks hit my face. I retracted the gun, and he fell over, the hole in his head pouring blood onto the carpet. "What have you done?" a voice cried out from the end of the hallway. I looked up. My grandpa stood at the end of the hallway, his hand gripped tightly on a hay hook, presumably from our barn. He looked around, observing my body count, a look of horror on his face. He came storming down the hall, quickly stopping in his tracks when I raised up the rifle. I aimed him down, keeping him where he stood. I pulled the trigger, but the gun only clicked. I looked down at the gun in confusion and pulled the trigger again. It clicked. It was out of bullets. I looked up at him, and he laughed at me. He began walking towards me again. I dropped the gun, looking around me with the mere seconds I had to find something else to defend myself. The knife was nowhere to be found. I thought my mother may have fallen on top of it, but I didn't have time to move her body. I swiftly ran into the closet, grabbing anything I could find in the darkness. My hand grazed across a wooden baseball bat. I snatched it quickly, until the jarring sensation of a blade dug into my shoulder. He had swung the hook into my skin, leaving me screaming in agony as he pressed his foot against my back. Pulling the hook in deeper, he yanked it back, knocking a windless scream out of me and dragging me back into the hallway. I tried to keep my grip on the baseball bat, but it slipped out and plopped right outside the door frame. I wriggled as he dragged me out, the hook feeling like it was about to tear right through my skin. He dropped me, blood soaking through my shirt. He vigorously ripped the hook out from my skin, earning another agonizing scream from me. I placed my hand over the oozing wound, squinting my tear-filled eyes. He raised his arm up, ready to gouge my eyes out. I swiftly rolled over, just missing his attack. The hook pierced through the carpet and into the wooden floor. He groaned as he struggled with pulling it out, as it got caught on strings from the torn carpet. I stood up wobbly, growing dizzy from the blood loss. I stumbled over to the closet and grabbed the baseball bat. I lifted it up, swirled it in the air, and aimed it down, building up a good enough swing. Before he could get the hook out, he looked up at me. I swung the bat up, slamming it into his chin. He stood up, his legs moving like jelly. His back slammed against the wall. I had caved his jaw in. Teeth fell out, along with a waterfall of blood. The crunchy sound of broken bones as he tried to open his mouth. The youth was slowly leaving him. Wrinkles grew quickly. Strands of hair growing from blonde to gray, patches of hair retracting into his scalp and forming bald spots. He looked like a grandpa again. I lowered the blood-soaked bat again and hit him with another uppercut, his head splitting off his body, jumping up with his spine attached to it like a toy. His head slid back down into his neck, and he stumbled around, blood circling down his entire neck. He collapsed to the ground, blood pouring everywhere. I stood over him, my heart and lungs on fire. I couldn't believe I had just done that. He broke like porcelain. I dropped the bat with tired hands and looked for the knife. It was an easier and more lethal weapon. I approached my mother's corpse. Her bloody face caved in. I wiped a tear that came quickly. She saved me. The only family member who wasn't trying to eat me. I rolled her body over, weakened from all the wounds. The knife was hidden under her body. I grabbed it and stumbled down the hallway. I flew down the steps, tripping on a few of them. I limped towards the front door, the feeling of escape so close. I grabbed the cold metal handle. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself conscious, and I turned the knob and cracked open the door. The sweet taste of freedom turned sour as I felt a sharp pain in my upper arm. I began to scream, my shout growing louder as the pain grew stronger. I looked over. My grandma was sinking her teeth into my arm, her eyes rolling into the back of her head, my arm spazzing from the pain, my grip on the knife loosening and dropping it to the ground. She collected a clump of bloody flesh in her mouth and began to pull on it, my skin and muscle stretching like gum. I fell to my knees, screaming until my throat practically bled. She pulled farther until my skin gave out and broke off. She chewed on the chunk of meat, swirling it around in her mouth like a piece of steak. She threw her head back, moaning in pleasure as she fed off my youth. Her hair grew longer, the gray strands vanishing, and her skin looking baby soft. She reached her peak age once again. She cackled devilishly as I looked down in horror at the gushing wound she left. I swiftly grabbed the knife off the ground and sliced her ankle. "You little bitch," she exclaimed in pain. I tried to open the door and run away as far as I could, but I was too slow. She wrapped her hand around my neck, dragging me back and choke-slamming me to the ground, the knife slipping out of my hands, sliding just out of reach. She sat on top of me, wrapping both hands around my neck. She slowly squeezed tighter and tighter, completely blocking my windpipe. Tears in my eyes filled to the brim as I felt the blood trapped in my head. I coughed up saliva as I wriggled around to break free. She stared down at me, flashing her teeth with a ferocious smile as she awaited my demise. She leaned in closer. "I love watching the life fade out of the young, like draining blood from a chicken," she sniggered as I slowly began to black out. I made one last attempt at survival before she crushed my windpipe. I stretched my hand out, my fingers about to detach as I reached for the knife. I grazed the handle of the knife with my fingertips. It was so close. The energy in my arm grew weaker as my neck tightened in her clutch. Right before my life began flashing before my eyes, I got a decent grip of the knife. She began opening her mouth wide, ready to bite down on my face and feast. Before she could, I lifted up the knife with every bit of life left in me and shoved the blade into her mouth. Blood immediately began pouring out of her throat and onto my face. Her grip slowly began to let go, my throat clearing up space to breathe. I took in as many breaths as I could as I slowly pushed the knife deeper. She choked up blood, squirting it onto my face as I pierced the knife through the back of her throat. I twisted the knife around, the blade grinding against her teeth. She fell over, her grip entirely loosened. I took in a breath so deep it could have popped my lungs. I could feel the blood flowing back through my body. I coughed up a bit of bloody saliva. I looked over at her corpse. Her hair turned a frail silver again, and her skin wrinkly and baggy. I did it. I survived. Everyone. I disorientedly stood up, the sudden movement too much for my body to handle. I approached the door. The coolness of the handle soothed my hand. But before I could leave, I remembered I had forgotten something. I leaned down and pulled the knife out from my grandmother's throat, blood spurting out from her throat and across the tan wooden floor. I limped upstairs, walked down the hall. I looked at the bodies as I passed them. When I reached the room, I could hear my great-grandmother's dying breaths. I slowly opened the door, the light from the hall peering into the dark room. My great-grandma sat in a wheelchair, one they never cared to let her move around in. I approached her with a stare. You would have thought she was dead if her lungs weren't pumping. She didn't look at me. I didn't think she even knew I was there. I tilted my head, just staring at her as she slowly breathed with a deep wheeze. It was a strangely peaceful connection for a moment. But all good things come to an end. I cranked my arm back and swung the knife into the side of her head. The blade went straight through, the tip of it pointing out the other side of her face. She didn't look any different than when she was alive. Blood trickled down the side of her face as she slumped over in her chair. I stayed silent, watching her corpse lie. I stood and thought to myself for a moment. Fuck this family. I stumbled back down the steps. Half of my body's blood supply spilled across the house. My grandmother's corpse still lay near the front door, her death long awaited. I limped past her, blood dripping off the sole of my shoe as I stepped in the pool. I reached for the door with a heavy hand, trying to at least get outside before I fainted from my injuries. My vision slowly grew fuzzy as I stumbled forward, grabbing the doorknob to keep myself up. The knife clanked against the floor as it slipped from my weak grip, my arm resting by my side. I sat on my knees, resting my head against the door as I took deep, slow breaths. I couldn't give up now. I did too much to get where I was. I gripped the knob tightly, groaning as I lifted myself up.
I slowly creaked the door open, my eyelids impulsively squeezing shut as the bright sunlight beamed. I slid out the door, the cool air satisfying to breathe. I lifted my head, closing my eyes and taking savory breaths. I hadn't gotten the chance to just breathe. I quickly collapsed to my knees, pressing my blood-soaked palms against the concrete pathway. My jaw trembled as tears welled in my eyes. It felt like everything had just hit me. I killed everyone. I killed my entire family. The thought forced tears out of my eyes. It was a fight for survival, but at what cost? I let myself sob. I deserved to feel something else other than anger. When I emptied the sadness from my body, I wiped off my damp cheeks, weakly getting on my feet. I sniffled as I looked around my gated community. Nobody was outside, but I needed help. I staggered off my front porch and into the street. I went for the first house that was directly across mine. The car was in the driveway. I almost tripped up the smooth stone steps as I approached the big metal doors. With all my strength, I pounded against it. "Please, help me," I pleaded. My simple cries felt over-exaggerating. But there was no response. I banged again, my arms ready to drop. "Please, I'm injured badly," I cried, breathing heavily. Suddenly, the sound of clicking heels came tapping towards the door. My eyes widened with hope, until the door wasn't open. I eyed the side of the house, catching the resident peeking through their pulled-back curtains. She didn't look worried or panicked. She looked disgusted. I stared back in silence, a beg for help gleaming in my eye. She threw the curtains back, her footsteps leading towards the door. She inched the door open, just enough to fit her head through. "I don't know what dumpster you dragged yourself out of, but get off my property before I call security. How'd you even get in here?" she warned. I'm literally your..." I tried to explain, but she slammed the door shut. I stood in shock. Did she not recognize me? With a dropped jaw, I stumbled off her front porch and tried another house, and another house, and another house. Each ignored my life pleas, told me to fuck off, or weren't even home. After my last attempt, I gave up, standing aimlessly in the street like a lost dog. If nobody was going to help me, I needed to help myself. I made my way back to that wretched house, hoping it was my last time. I sighed as I threw the door open, seeing my grandmother's corpse once again. I wished she'd just vanish, like a dead enemy in a video game. I limped up the stairs again, back into the blood-painted hallway. The bodies were still spread across the ground, the blood drying into the fabric of the carpet. I needed to find a phone, which is actually harder than you'd think. My great-grandmother owned the house, so all rules were written by her. She felt that house phones would allow spirits of the house to speak to us, so we never had those. I wasn't allowed my own cell phone because I could get one when I was able to pay for my own, so that made this even harder. I had to take the bet that one of my family members had their phones on them. I started with my parents' corpses. They laid close to each other. My father's brain matter dried to the carpet. I kneeled down, almost losing my balance, and began pilfering through every pocket. Nothing. Even in death, he was fucking useless. I turned to my mother's corpse, pausing for a moment. I couldn't avert my gaze from her decimated face. The sight churned my stomach. She deserved better. I held back tears as I searched through her pockets, ending up with nothing. I stood up, making my way towards my aunt and uncle. After checking my uncle's corpse, I was left with my aunt. I stepped over her corpse, approaching the mess that I left my aunt in. I carefully danced around the shards of glass that scattered across the ground. I reached down, sliding my hand into her pocket. My eyes shot open as my finger grazed the corner of a phone. I quickly grasped it, trying to slide it out of her tight jeans. Suddenly, my legs gave out. I groaned and I dropped to the ground, grabbing the frame of the table to keep myself up. I wasn't getting any stronger. I needed to act fast. I lifted myself back up, my arm shaking. I used my other hand to pull the phone out, and then stumbled out of the room. I dabbled my fingers against my shoulder wound, baring my teeth as it stung. Blood covered my fingertips. I was still bleeding badly. I wiped them off against my pants and kept walking. I walked down those steps for the last time, feeling as hard as ever to do so. I stepped outside, looking behind me as I closed the door. I lifted the phone, praying it wasn't dead. I sighed with relief and a smile as it turned on. Thank God old people don't put passwords on their phones either. I opened the phone app and dialed 911. I raised the phone to my ear, tapping my teeth together as it rang.
911 operator, what's your emergency?
A woman on the other end asked. I have a medical emergency. I have multiple injuries, I explained.
What is your address?
She went on. I told her my address, explaining that I'm in a gated community.
An ambulance is on their way,
she informed me. Okay, thank you. I sat down on my curb, feeling dizzy. She asked me a few more questions about my injuries and what happened. It was hard explaining that my entire family tried to murder me and feast on my corpse. I eventually hung up the call, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. I looked around my street with tired eyes. It was so dull you'd think it was abandoned. All the trimmed bushes and parked Cadillacs don't cover the fact that everyone hated each other and thought they were better than everyone. After a few minutes, the sound of sirens broke me out of my thought cloud. The ambulance pulled up in front of my house, the colored lights spinning. I stood up and 2 men hopped up. Thank you. My words trailed off as I suddenly felt numb. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurry and my head muffled. She's losing a lot of blood, one of the men exclaimed in panic, motioning for the other to get a stretcher. They pulled it out of the back of the ambulance, lifting me onto it. My eyes slid around, my eyelids desperately wanting to close. I looked at the blue sky and the faces of the panicked men carrying me. It was hard for me to make out what they looked like. Everything was fuzzy. They lifted me into the ambulance, a woman sitting on the back with me. She lifted my head, strapping a mask to my face, and began pumping something into my lungs. Within seconds, I felt exhausted. My vision blurred even further, everything in a mist. But before I blacked out, it's funny. I looked at the woman and I could have sworn she had 3 eyes. I slowly opened my eyes, staring at a blurring ceiling. I was laying down comfortably, my back supported by a soft bed. I reached up to rub my eyes, quickly feeling the weight of tubes that ran into my arms. I wiped the fuzziness from my vision, blinking rapidly. I made it to the hospital without dying. I looked over at the heart rate monitor as it beeped, mesmerized by the green bar as it rose and dropped to my heartbeat. There were wrinkled green curtains that separated the beds for privacy. Nurses fast walked by, masks covering their mouths. I reached up to touch the bandage on my forehead, flinching as it stung. "Oh, you're awake," a nurse suddenly exclaimed as she noticed me. She walked over, a clipboard in hand. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Like shit," I chuckled weakly, wheezing as I coughed. "That's the usual with injuries like these," she said, leaning down towards me. "How long was I out for?" I questioned. "A short 3 hours, I think," she answered, jotting something down. "I'm gonna change your bandages. This might sting a bit," she warned me. She gripped the gauze, my eyes shooting open as she applied unexpected pressure. I held in cries as she pressed into my wound, vigorously ripping off the bandage. I couldn't tell if she was extremely inexperienced or she did it on purpose. She dangled the crimson-soaked cloth, then dropped it into her pocket. She pulled out a clean gauze and medical tape. I almost shot up out of bed and she pushed the gauze against my wound, practically shoving her finger into it. "Please, less pressure," I pleaded. "Sorry, honey, it'll be just a moment." She ignored my request. She taped it down, my shoulder throbbing as she ran her finger over to make it stick. I squeezed my eyes, a tear running down my cheek. "Oh, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to be so rough," she apologized, her tone ditzy. She grated her thumb across my cheek, wiping away my tear. With a smile, she began walking away. I stared at her in confusion and a bit of shock. Why did she manhandle me? Then I caught something strange. As she turned the corner, almost behind the curtain, she put her thumb in her mouth and licked it clean. Did she just eat my tears? I thought to myself, absolutely baffled. I uncomfortably shifted around in my bed, my shoulder raging with pain again. I stayed observant like a hawk for a few hours, the nurse never returning since. In my time, I noticed a few things. First of all, the place seemed extremely understaffed. I think the only nurse I saw walk back and forth was the one that practically abused me. And a man walked by a few times, seemingly a doctor, but that was it. The only people that worked on this floor. Speaking of floors, I never saw anyone leave this one. From my viewpoint, the hospital seemed to be in a T shape. The rows of beds were at the top, and then one long hallway that leads to other rooms, then the staircase and elevators. My bed resided in front of that hallway, giving me a bird's eye view. I had not seen one person enter or exit the staircase, neither the elevator. And I thought I was overreacting. I lost a lot of blood, so I didn't exactly possess clarity, but I came from a family of psychotic cannibals. I could smell suspiciousness, like a drop of blood in a bottomless ocean. The one thing that stayed under my skin was the nurse. A medical professional could not be that reckless. She was like a caricature. My tears, she licked it off her finger. Everything just felt so strange, like I was on an episode of The Twilight Zone. I knew I sounded paranoid, nitpicking with these observations till I was visited by the nurse. It was around 7 p.m., the sun almost set. She smiled as she appeared around the curtain, holding an IV bag. I faked a smile. "We meet again," she joked. I nodded, letting out a stale chuckle. "I'm going to change your IV for the night," she explained, unhooking the old bag. She then reached for my arm, giving me a moment before she pulled the needle out. "This might hurt a bit. It's okay to scream or cry," she tried to reassure me. I'll be fine," I croaked, her comment rubbing me the wrong way. She unwrapped the tape, gripping the needles that were buried in my arm. Suddenly, she tore them out of my arm. A scream escaped my mouth as I almost flew off the bed. I looked down at my arm with wide eyes, blood squirting out of the holes. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she apologized, reaching in her pocket for gauze pads. I glared at her like she was insane. My jaw dropped. She ignored my gaze and pressed the pads against my wound. The white cloth quickly ran red as my gushing blood soaked into it. While holding it down, she used her other hand to pull out tape, tearing off a piece and using it to keep the gauze down. "That should stop the bleeding eventually." She straightened her back. I continued to stare at her in shock. I couldn't believe what she had just done. She pulled the needle out like a plug from an outlet. She was about to walk away until she turned to me. She stared at me intensely, like she was studying my face. Her expression showed that a thought ran through her head. "You're a tough cookie, aren't you?" She smirked, sounding scornful. I kept silent, continuing to stare. She eventually walked away, my eyes following her until she disappeared. I looked down at my arm, groaning as I bent it. It wasn't the worst of my injuries, but it felt like a really intense bruise. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I needed to get the fuck out of there. I waited until the lights turned off and the floor was clear. When the time was right, I slowly slid off the bed. Goosebumps ran across my skin as my bare feet touched the cold, polished floors. I peered past the curtains, not having seen past them. I looked left and right, perking up like a dog as I noticed a beaming red exit sign. I stepped out from behind the curtain, tiptoeing towards the exit. I would just go through the door, fly down the steps, and escape to somewhere. As I continued down the pathway, I looked over, slowly stopping. The beds were empty. I backtracked a bit, realizing that every bed was empty. Where are the other patients? I shook it off and continued on towards the exit. When I reached the door, I pressed my hands on the cold metal bar, praying an alarm wouldn't go off. I clenched my fist as I pushed into it, preparing to run for my life, until the door didn't open. I scrunched my eyebrows as I repeatedly pushed it, in realization that it was locked. Why would they lock an emergency exit? I thought, fear beginning to grow inside of me. I turned back again, finding myself at square one. My only other options were the staircase or the elevator. I wrapped my hands around the corner, peeking my head out. It was clear, so I slid around and went for it. Suddenly, a muffled conversation caught my ear. I stopped in my tracks, trying to locate the source of the sound. I noticed two silhouettes through the curtain of a room window. I stayed quiet and froze as I listened in. "Are you trying to make it obvious?" a man berated. I'm sorry. You asked for tears or screams. I did my best." A woman apologized. "One fucking tear that you saved for yourself. Humans aren't dumb. We can't have another escapee. We can't afford another cover-up. Get your shit together," he hissed through his teeth. Humans. Odd word choice. "Look, we could just move her to the basement early. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to make her suspicious," she suggested. "The basement? You want to move her early? Do it yourself. You're the one who wanted to deal with her anyway. Go fucking prove yourself or something," he demanded, his footsteps storming off. I didn't know the context of this conversation, and I didn't want to. It just gave me more of a reason to get out as soon as possible. I crouch-walked towards the elevator, pressing the button. I sat impatiently as I waited for it to arrive at my floor. After sitting there for a few seconds, it seemed like I was on a higher floor than I realized. Suddenly, clicking heels walked towards the door. My neck twisted around, eyeing the door to the room. The elevator wasn't coming any faster, and I couldn't take chances. I quietly sprinted back down the hall, clenching my teeth as I heard the elevator doors open. How convenient. I turned the corner, pressed my back against the wall. I could hear the door suddenly open. The nurse stepped out. I cautiously peered around the corner, attempting to see her position. She stood, staring at the open elevator, a needle in hand. I swiftly retracted my head as she looked down the hall, a look of suspicion in her eye. She began walking down the hall towards my empty bed. I sidestepped farther across the wall, praying she wouldn't see me. She walked through the doorway, stopping my breath for a moment so I did not alert her. She approached my bed, raising the needle as she slowly lifted the blanket. I lightly jolted as she realized I wasn't there, throwing the blanket back down in frustration. "Little bitch," she scoffed under her breath. "She's going to start looking for me. I needed a plan, fast. There was a high chance she'd end up seeing me anyways, so I'd have to trust my legs to carry me to freedom." I slowly went for the elevator. My sight locked on her as she threw curtains out of the way, desperately searching for me. As I turned the corner, she whipped around. Both of our eyes widened as our gazes crossed. We froze for a moment, as if she was scared as well. In the mere seconds of the pause, I realized I wasn't going to make it to the elevator. I then realized I was going to enter another fight for my life. I broke into a sprint, bolting past her. She unfroze, running right on my tail. As I ran, I realized the hall was short, so I was either going to have to dodge her extensively or kill her. The decision was quickly made for me as she leapt onto my back. Unable to handle the weight, I tumbled into a metal cabinet, crashing into the floor. I groaned in pain as we wrestled on the floor. She raised her arm, trying to inject me with the needle. I blocked it as she swung down, my arm shaking as I held back her force. She gripped her other hand around my arm, pinning it to the ground. We were in a face-to-face struggle, her hot breath hitting me. Her skin was beating red, her mouth stretched open to reveal inhumanly jagged teeth. I wriggled the arm she held down, attempting to release her grip. "Just fucking sleep," she growled, forcing the needle towards me. Groans tried to escape through my teeth as the needle almost grazed my skin. I tugged at my arm with all my might, lifting it off the ground with her grip still attached. I directed her arm towards my mouth, quickly sinking my teeth into her skin. She craned her head back, her screams of agony growing stronger as I bit harder. She dropped the needle, using her other arm to pull herself from my grip. As blood began pooling in my mouth, I realized. She gripped her arm, staring at the wound as she whimpered. Blood oozed out of the tooth-sized holes, dripping down her arm. While she was distracted, I snatched the needle and swiftly pierced it into her eyeball. She stumbled backwards, breathlessly crying. The needle was stuck in deep, moving around with her eyeball. She lifted her trembling arm, gripping the needle. She moaned in pain as she slowly removed it, blood trailing down her cheek. After removing it entirely, she dropped it to the ground, her bitten arm dangling at her side. She looked at me, her eyeball red. She wiped away the streak of blood, baring her teeth. She stormed towards me, ready to kill me with her bare hands. I scrambled across the ground, trying to get back on my feet. As I crawled, my hand pressed against cold metal. I looked down, noticing a scalpel under my palm. I gripped it tightly, whipping around with a slash. I hit a bullseye, slicing across her hand as she reached for me. She yelped as she retracted her hand, blood dripping onto the floor. I stumbled till I stood, planting my feet into the ground. I raised the scalpel at her, my hand shaking. Our eyes met, daggers in her gaze, but a sharper one in my hand. She wagged her hand, shaking the blood off as she came after me. She swung at my hand in an attempt to disarm me. I leaned backwards, pressing my arms against my chest to keep them out of her distance. Open for an attack, I lunged towards her, pulling the scalpel into her neck. Her eyes shot open as the blade hit a weak spot. Blood exploded out like a geyser within seconds of pulling out the blade. She tried to keep her balance, blood leaking between her fingers as she tried to plug the hole with her palm. Within seconds, she collapsed to the ground. I dropped the scalpel, my lungs on fire. Suddenly, as I watched the blood pool around her corpse, she began to change. Her skin darkened to a deep red. Her hair disintegrated. Her jaw lowered as it made room to fit long, razor-sharp teeth. I scanned her corpse up and down in confusion. It had made a full transformation. "Oh, what the fuck are you?" I whispered to myself, my eyebrows scrunched. I tiptoed around her corpse, unable to take my eyes off of it. I reached the elevator again, pressing the button. I looked over at the door, remembering that the doctor, or whatever he is, was still there. My teeth chattered as I waited anxiously, staring at the glowing button. I periodically looked behind me, waiting for him to burst out the door. My anxieties cooled down as the elevator beeped, the doors sliding open. I stepped in, pressing the first floor button. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a door opening. I looked up, noticing the doctor staring right back at me. My eyes shot open as I began to press the closed door button. "Stop," he demanded, running towards me as the doors began to close. Close, fucking close," I begged as I rapidly pressed the button. I clenched my limbs as he just failed to reach me, his fists slamming against the closed doors. I breathed deeply, a pit in my stomach. I felt barely safe for a moment as I traveled between floors, until it came to a halted stop. I looked up at the floor number. I had stopped at the second. Close enough. I waited until the elevator doors opened. My guard raised up again, as the opening doors revealed a concerning scene. I slowly stepped out under flickering lights, blood streaks running across the floor. I tilted my head, eyeing down the hall. Papers were scattered around, bedpans and other equipment scattered about. It felt like I walked into the aftermath of something. I stepped back into the elevator, pressing the floor button a few times. It screeched as it tried to move, but ultimately stayed stuck. I remembered the staircase next to it. I gripped the door handle, grunting as I tugged on it. I groaned in frustration. It was locked. Fuck, I muttered under my breath, stepping back into the hallway. I had to find another staircase. Before I continued down the hall, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A fire axe sat in a glass container on the wall. I slid my arm into my shirt and elbowed the glass. It shattered easily, almost thin as paper. I reached past the shards, lifting the axe off its stand. I felt its weight in my hand, gripping it with my other one as well. I didn't know if I'd need it, but it wouldn't hurt to have it on me. I prowled down the hall, my feet sticking to dried blood. Broken lights hung down from the ceiling as the others flickered. More blood painted across the floors and walls. There had to have been a full-on massacre. When I reached the end of the hall, I peered around both corners. More empty beds lined the wall, a few of the blankets stained with blood. I hid behind the wall as I noticed something at the end of the hallway. A man was leaning over behind a curtain, grabbing something. He straightened his back, revealing a body in his hands. The person was injured, but they didn't appear to be dead. I flipped my back against the wall as he began walking towards me. I lifted the axe, gripping the handle tightly with both hands. I kept my ears open for the sound of his footsteps, the floor vibrating as he grew closer. When I felt he was close enough, I appeared from behind the corner, throwing my whole body into the swing of my axe. My eyes darted around in confusion as the blade hit the wall. The man had vanished. Suddenly, a chill crawled up my spine as fingers slowly wrapped around my shoulder. I whipped around with a swing, feeling like I was going insane as there was nobody standing in front of me.
Where do you think you're going?
A gravelly voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, swinging the axe throughout the air. I felt taps on my shoulders as he laughed sinisterly, making me twist and turn. I couldn't tell if he was extremely fast or just invisible. I then felt something slice across my arm. I yelped in pain as I looked down, blood seeping into one of those jagged slashes that ran across my skin. I swiftly bent my neck as I felt a stream of air fly by my ear. I swung my axe around again, still not getting a hit. I quickly pressed my hand against my cheeks as he attacked my face. I removed my hand, blood trailing through the crevices of my palm. I made one last attempt at an attack. I pressed the bottom of the handle against my stomach. The blade extended outwards. I began spinning in a circle, covering any ground that he could have been on. I stopped shortly as my lungs began to singe with exhaustion. Where the fuck could he be? Then it clicked. I slowly looked up. My eyes widened at the sight of the man latched to the ceiling. His skin was pale, his long nails hooked into the panels. His body was facing the ceiling, his skin on his neck straining as he had twisted around to stare at me. Before I could make a move, he retracted his claws and dropped above me. I screamed as the weight of his body crashed me to the ground, the axe slipping from my grip and sliding across the floor. I groaned as I held his arms back, his claws desperately trying to reach me. I stared deeply into his eyes, his iris a dark red. I slid my hands up to his arms until I could easily grab his claws. I clumped them together into my grip, bending them backwards. He hissed in pain as I pushed farther until they snapped in half. He leapt off of me, pressing his arms against his chest like a T-Rex. I scrambled to my feet, rushing over to grab the axe. I stood steadily, staring him down with the axe raised. He stared back, stretching out his fingers with now destroyed claws. And then, as I closed my eyes to blink, he vanished as I reopened them. I looked up at the ceiling, and he hadn't gone there either. Come on, I groaned in frustration. I realized he had somehow snuck behind me as his arm wrapped around my neck. My eyes shot open as he applied enough pressure to cut off my airways. I attempted to reach behind me, trying to snatch him or gouge his eye, but he used his other hand to hold my arm down, squeezing my throat harder. My throat croaked as I desperately tried to breathe, and then I realized he stupidly forgot to apprehend the arm that had a weapon. With the strength of one arm, I swung the axe behind me. He shrieked in agony as he released me from his grip. I fell to my knees, coughing up saliva as my throat opened up, trying to take in deep breaths. I wiped spit off of my lips, lifting myself off the ground. He stumbled into the wall, the axe stuck in his face. I rushed him, ripping the axe out of his face. I earned more screams from him as blood squirted onto my face, a deep gash running across his forehead. Taking away his chance to escape again, I flipped the axe around to the other blade and swung at one end of his stomach. He let out groans of pain as he gripped his gut, blood soaking through his clothes. I gripped the handle tighter, baring my teeth as I tore the blade across his stomach, then retracting it as I hit the other end. Blood poured out of his body like a waterfall as he fell to his knees. Organs began to slip out of the deep laceration, his skin painted red as he desperately tried to shove them back in with weak hands. I stood over him, my chest lifting as I breathed. He looked at me as I raised the axe, his dark pupils shrieking. I roared as I swung it down onto his head. The blade sliced through his head like a wooden log, splitting it into two as it reached his mouth. I yanked the axe out, blood shooting onto my shirt. The two halves of his axe wobbled around as he fell over, his exposed organs hitting the ground with a wet slap. I watched as his corpse transformed like the nurse, his hair decayed away and his skin faded to gray. I kneeled down, observing his corpse. "Are you some kind of demon? Or monster?" I questioned aloud, as if he'd answer. I stood up, sucking air through my teeth as I wiped blood off my cheek, the cut stinging. I looked down at my arm, blood dripping onto the floor from the cut. I reached for the corpse's clothes, tearing off a strand of his thin white coat. I wrapped it around my arm as a makeshift bandage, blood quickly soaking through. I searched down the hall for another staircase, my eyebrows raised as one caught my eye. I ran over, grabbing the knob excitedly, and my face fell as I realized it was locked as well. "Oh, fucking hell!" I exclaimed in frustration, slamming my fist against the window of the door. I aimlessly walked around, absolutely stumped. All the staircases were locked. It was as if they didn't want anybody descending any further. Are they hiding something? What's the motive? Left with nothing else, I decided to try the elevator again. The doors were still open, so I stepped back in and pressed the first floor button again. Nothing happened. I pressed it again and again and again. I was about to break it. "Come on, fucking work," I exclaimed, pounding the button with my fist. Suddenly, the speakers let out a small ding. My head perked up, noticing the doors slowly closing. I stepped back, a satisfied smile on my face. The elevator jolted down a bit, but stayed stuck. I looked down, my blood beginning to boil. Suddenly, I lost my balance as the elevator began to drop. I stumbled to the wall, holding the metal bar as the elevator screeched. Everything shook as I descended at full speed, until it crashed at the bottom floor. I groaned as I fell to the ground. I looked up at the floor number, but the light had broken. It wasn't hard to guess that I had hit the basement. I stood up, dropped the axe, and forced my fingers between the elevator doors. I grunted as I used all my strength to force them open, barely able to get it to separate by an inch. I let go, taking deep breaths. Then, a light bulb lit above my head. I lifted the axe and jammed the blade between the doors. I pushed against the handle, the metal creaking as it separated. I pushed harder, trying to make enough space to fit my hand through. Suddenly, the blade snapped off the wood, clanking to the ground. I quickly shoved my hand between the doors to stop it from closing. I dropped the handle, using both hands to pry the door open. When they were successfully open, I picked up the handle and the blade. There was no way of reattaching them. It was useless as a weapon. I tossed them in the corner of the elevator and stepped into the basement. I wrapped my goosebump-ridden arms across myself, the temperature dropping quickly. The basement was dark and bleak, the walls and floors a gray stone, weak lights illuminating the hall. I slowly continued on, my bare feet slapping against the cold floors. I peered around the corner at the end of the hall. It was vastly empty, rusted pipes that clanked as heat pumped through them lined across the walls. I turned the corner, observing a few different rooms as I walked past. Most of them were unhelpful to me. Things like the janitor's closet or plumbing, rooms that rang with sounds of steam. None of them were a staircase or an elevator, so they were useless. Till I reached the end of the hall and found a room that wasn't like the others. I stepped in front of it as strange sounds caught my ear. There were 2 big green doors, screw holes where a sign once was. I hesitantly pressed my ear against the door. The sounds were unrecognizable, possibly plumbing sounds. What was more concerning was what sounded like human grumbling. Disturbed, I pulled away from the door, looking down at the paint-chipped doorknob. I was too curious, so I reached for it, slowly turning it. I opened the door to just a crack, peeking inside. It was hard to get a good look, so I continued to open the door frame. When it was fully open, my jaw crashed to the ground. I couldn't process what I was seeing. About a dozen people hung from the ceiling, their hands and feet stretched out and tied to hooks. Some of them were presumably doctors, wearing white coats, others seeming to be patients, wearing hospital gowns. Ventilation masks covered their mouths, appearing to be pumping oxygen. The dangling tubes were attached to tall, thin steel tanks. I slowly approached the tanks, my wide eyes locked on the person it was attached to. They appeared to be unconscious. I looked down at the tank, detaching the tube from it. I hesitantly gripped the knob, slowly turning it. Suddenly, a jolt ran through my body as an ear-piercing sound exploded from the tank. I quickly sealed it again, reattaching the tube, my ears ringing. That was not oxygen. It sounded like a scream. I looked up, slapped my hand against my mouth to hold in a shout as I crossed gazes with the person. They stared at me, fear in their eyes. "What happened to you?" I whispered as I removed the hand from my mouth. He tried to speak, but was unable to, letting out panicked groans. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Rubber cups were attached under his eyes, sewn to his skin. Clear tubes ran from the cups to the ground, the end of them sitting in a glass jar. I knelt down, leaning close to see inside. There was a bit of water inside. It didn't make any sense. I looked back up at the cup, then back down at the jar, trying to make the connection. Then my head jerked up as I realized. They were collecting tears. I thought about the nurse wiping away my tears and then licking it off her finger. Why are they collecting tears? I stood up, observing the rest of the people. They were all connected to tanks and jars, too. I slowly stepped back, trying to take in the room at its full scale. I blinked rapidly, still trying to understand what I was looking at. I yelped as I suddenly bumped into something, whipping around to the sound of glass clinking together. I had hit a shelf, glass jars and bottles clumped together. I lifted a jar, a piece of tape stuck to it. Tears was written across it. They seemed to be storing them. I slid them around, grabbing a bottle. I ran my fingers over the label as it read, "Fear." I twisted the cap off, almost dropping the bottle as a scream suddenly rang out. I whipped around to see if anyone else was down here with me. Confused, I turned back around and grabbed another bottle with the same label. Again, a disturbing scream was let out as I twisted the cap off. Are they bottling screams? How is that even possible? I looked over at the tanks, everything making more sense while getting even more confusing. It's not oxygen in the tanks, it's screams. I shifted around a few more bottles, reading labels like laughter and anger and other emotions. I didn't know why, but they managed to contain human emotions. And what were they using them for? My train of thought was cut off as the people began to groan. I turned around, realizing that they had all woken up. They wriggled around, screaming under their masks as they knocked jars over, their eyes locked on me. My eyes shifted around to each of them. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. Suddenly, loud footsteps began to echo from down the hall. I quickly slid into the corner, bunching up into a ball and praying whoever it was would go away. Of course, nothing was ever easy, as I heard them getting closer, but the people wouldn't stop wriggling around. They wanted my help so desperately. I felt guilty, but I was left with no choice. I held my breath, pressing my knees against my chest as someone walked in. The people stopped moving at the sight of her presence. "Calm down. You're making a mess for nothing," she berated them. She stood a few jars up, menacingly walking in front of them. She randomly stopped in front of one of them, caressing her finger across their face. "What makes you think this was going to work?" she asked in a childish, condescending tone. Their bulging eyes turned to me. She took notice of this. "Have you seen a ghost or something?" she asked, turning around. We locked eyes, my body paralyzed with pins and needles. Within a second, she came lunging at me. I impulsively grabbed a bottle off the shelf, smashed it against her head before she could reach me. The glass shattered, a deafening scream bursting from the bottle. She stumbled around, plugging her ears as blood trickled down her forehead. I ran out the door, pushing myself off the wall as I fell into it. I flew down the hall, my heartbeat in sync with my pounding footsteps. I hooked around the corner, almost crashing to the ground. I passed the elevator and found a staircase that she had to have come from. I tugged on the doorknob, on the brink of crying as it was locked. I noticed under the knob was a keyhole. I then realized she probably had the keys that I'd have to remove from her corpse when I murdered her. The basement had nothing to defend myself, so I'd have to get creative. I peered around the corner, watching as she limped out of the room, a bottle in her hand. She stood in the middle of the hall, twisting the cap off the bottle. She quickly shoved the neck of the bottle into her mouth, a scream puffing up her cheeks as it ran in her throat. She swallowed the scream, beginning to breathe heavily. Then I realized they're not just storing human emotions, they're consuming them. I observed from behind the wall as she growled with each breath, her skin slowly turning red and her irises glowing. And finally, dark, goat-like horns began to erect from her head, stopping as they curled. I felt like I was trapped with an enraged bull. She began storming down the hall, her feet practically about to crack the ground. Unable to hide, I needed to find something to fight. I looked around, filled with hopelessness by the emptiness, until I noticed a hanging pipe, water dripping out the end. I quickly ran out in her line of sight, latching onto the pipe as I tried to break it off. She came barreling towards me as I pulled harder. When she was too close for comfort, I snapped the pipe off and swung it at her. I smashed the side of her head, leaving me shocked as the pipe bounced off her head, the metal vibrating. She stood unharmed. Her head had dented the pipe. It was like hitting a boulder. She yanked the pipe from my grip, swiftly swinging it at my head instead. I tumbled into the wall as my ear rang, blood instantly dripping down my face. My head pounded as I tried to see straight. Before I could even try and stand up, she wrapped her hand around my neck. She had the grip of a gorilla as she lifted me off the ground, about to crunch my throat. I grabbed at her arm as she hung me in the air, saliva bubbling through my teeth. Her eyes were ignited as they stared at me. Then, she tossed me across the hall. I fell through the air until I crashed to the ground, feeling like my ribs cracked on impact. With no time to stay down, I lifted myself with the last drops of adrenaline I had left and began stumbling down the hall. I desperately searched for a room to hide in as she stayed on my tail. I threw the janitor's closet door open, quickly throwing myself in and slamming the door shut. She immediately began tugging at the knob after I twisted the lock, stepping backwards, pressing my back against the shelf, knocking over bottles of cleaning supplies. She then began hitting the door repeatedly. I needed to find a weapon, fast. If she had the strength to bend a metal pipe, she had the strength to break down a door. I searched the room in panic, throwing around mops and bottles. I looked behind me, the door about to cave in. I needed to use what I had to my advantage. I grabbed a bottle of bleach, shaking it to see how much was left. It was about half full. I quickly twisted the cap off, my hand trembling. The door came crashing down, wood chips flying across the small room. She shoved it out of the way, preparing to lunge at me. I whipped around and tossed bleach at her face. She shrieked in agony as it doused her eyes, spazzing as she grabbed at her face. She stumbled backwards, practically clawing at her eyes. I rushed over, ready to attack. As she removed her hands from her face, I plunged my fingers into her eyes. She wailed even louder as she tried to pull my arms away. I shoved my thumbs in farther, swirling them around her eye sockets until her eyeballs turned to mush. She dropped to her knees, letting out blood-curdling cries as blood streamed down her cheeks like tears. She swung her arms around aimlessly, her eyes entirely demolished. I wiped off my thumbs against my pants, covered in blood and chunks of flesh. I then wrapped my hands around one of her horns and began to pull. Her shrieks grew louder and louder as the horn began to detach from her skin, strings of flesh splitting like melted bubblegum. With one last tug, I tore the horn off, earning a scream from her that was worth trapping in a bottle. Blood squirted from her head as she let out breathless cries. I tilted my head as I observed the horn, rubbing my fingers against its grooves. I looked down at her, realizing she wasn't over with. I held the horn like a knife, aiming at her gaping mouth that continued to let out sounds of agony. I pierced the horn through her mouth, her face dropping as blood began pooling in her mouth and trickling past her lips. She fully dropped to the ground, blood gurgling in her throat. I pressed my back against the wall, slowly sliding to the ground. I just needed a moment to breathe. My side throbbed as I sat. The pipe had done good damage. I leaned my head back, wetting my dry eyes as I blinked slowly. I enjoyed breathing slowly, for once. How do I always get myself into these situations? I chuckled to myself. Satisfied with my short break, I stood up, groaning as my sore ribs ached. I flipped her corpse over, digging through her pockets until I found the keys. They jingled as I lifted them, dropping them in my pocket. As I was about to walk towards the staircase, I remembered the people. I couldn't just leave them. I went back to the room, their eyes lighting up with excitement at the sight of me. One by one, I unhooked them, helping them onto the ground. "Thank you, thank you," a woman cried as she shook my hand, her whole body shaking. I had no idea what to say, so I just nodded. Before I led them to the staircase, I snatched a bottle of anger from the shelf and shoved it in my pocket. They seemed to be as good as grenades. I then left the room. The people followed behind me. They seemed to be stuck here for a long time, their legs weak like jelly. I unlocked the staircase, opening the door for them. "Go, quickly, and call the police," I ordered, motioning for them to run. They squeezed through the door, desperate to escape. They ran up the stairs like a stampede, and were out of my sight quickly. I followed suit, my wounds throbbing as I limped up the stairs. I finally reached the first floor as I pushed open the door. I stepped into the main lobby, seeing rows of waiting chairs in the front desk. I made my way into the lobby and realized the exit was to my left. Except a man was standing in front of the glass doors. I froze in silence as I watched the man stare out the doors, the prisoners running in the distance. "What have you done?" His voice shook, balling his fists as if he sensed my presence. It was the doctor that almost caught me earlier. He slowly turned around, the veins in his face bulging. His eyes were pure black, like staring into a void.
You'll pay for this,
he growled, his voice demonic. I ran away from sweet freedom as he came stomping towards me. I zigzagged around the hall as I pulled on every doorknob, being left with nothing but locked doors. I was so close, I couldn't die now. When I found an unlocked door, I threw it open and leapt inside. I slammed the door behind me, locking it quickly. I had entered an operating room, medical machinery standing around and a blue table in the middle. I began throwing open drawers, looking for any type of weapon. After finding useless things like stethoscopes, I snatched a bone saw. I almost jumped out of my skin as he began pounding on the door. I turned around, watching as it bounced on its hinges. I crept towards the door, facing my back against it as I got close. I slowly reached for the lock, twisting it to unlock the door. He tried to throw it open, but it was blocked by my body. He shoved his hand through the crack, trying to grab at me. That was my cue, as I threw my back against the door, loosing it on his wrist. He roared in pain from behind the door as he began kicking it, his trapped hand wriggling around. I reached over with the bone saw, pressing the blade against his wrist. He screamed in agony, rapidly kicking the door harder as I began to slice his hand off. The blade easily cut through his skin and muscle, blood squirting and dripping down the door. His hand began to slump as I hit his bone, blood pouring onto the floor. I gripped the saw with 2 hands as I cut through thick bone. He tried desperately to pull his hand out, but I kept enough pressure to keep it stuck. When I cut through his bone, I sliced through the rest of his skin, completely amputating his hand. It plopped into the pool of blood on the ground, white bone poking out of the stringy meat. Blood squirted out of his nub as he removed it from the door, my body pressure shutting it. I quickly locked it again, his wails ringing from behind the door. He was going to continue coming after me, and I wouldn't be able to pull off another stunt like that again. I then remembered the bottle that I stored in my pocket. I pulled it off, twisting it around in my grip. I thought of the ways I could use it to my advantage, but none of them would kill him. Until an idea popped up in my head that would either save my life or get me killed. I twisted the cap off, quickly shoving the bottle into my mouth. The sensation of the scream filling my mouth was indescribable. I could hear it in my ears. I squeezed my eyes closed as I somehow swallowed it. I stood for a moment, waiting for its effects to kick in. For a moment I was confused, as I felt completely fine, until my body began to feel hot. My limbs twitched as my skin grew hotter, the blood running through my veins feeling like magma. In mere seconds, I felt like I could split the earth in half with the stomp of my foot. I marched towards the door, my body feeling weighted. I threw the door open, the knob banging against the wall. The doctor stood, his back facing me as he whimpered, his hand wrapped around his bleeding nub. I rushed up behind him, dropping my foot into the back of his leg. He grunted as he dropped to his knees, holding himself up with one hand. I cracked him over the head with my heel, knocking him flat on the floor. He groaned in pain as I planted my left foot on his back and my right on the bicep of his good arm. I reached down and began pulling his arm back. He choked out screams as his bone began to crack. It felt like a fire had ignited within me, harboring pure rage. I gave it one last tug and snapped his arm. He tried to kick his legs into my back as he cried. Blood gushed out of his arm, jagged bone tearing through his skin. I stepped off of him, planting my feet at each of his sides. He groaned through his hyperventilating as I balled his hair up in my fist, lifting his head.
Please don't do this. My people need your resources,
he begged through his agony. I ignored his pleas and pressed the blade against his threat. It felt like bombs were exploding in my chest, my muscles straining. I began rapidly easing back and forth at his throat. He gargled out screams as blood sprayed across the floor. I bared my teeth, my eyes wide open as I pumped hot air out through my teeth. I let out a roar as I sliced faster, his stringy flesh tearing apart. With one last slash, I decapitated him. I raised his severed head up, blood dripping onto his body. My chest pumped as my lungs inflated with air, my heart feeling like a firework. Then, I crashed, The rage in my body plummeted, leaving me feeling exhausted. I dropped the bone saw in the head, blood spurting out as it rolled across the floor. I stumbled off his body, my limbs feeling weighted. I trekked down the hall on the brink of fainting. When I neared the doors, I dropped to my knees. My muscles couldn't handle any more, my vision blurring, but I was so close. I had to keep moving. I moaned as I stood up, dragging myself towards the door. I shoved the door open, leaning on it so I didn't fall. I took in a deep breath of the soothing air, closing my eyes. I did it. Again. I then looked up as the sound of sirens in the distance caught my attention. I was filled with hope for once as 3 cop cars skidded into the parking lot. One of the officers hopped out of his car, rushing over to help me. I fell into his arms as he walked towards his car. "You're okay. You're okay," he reassured me. He opened the car door, helping me in. I settled into the leather seat as he slammed the door shut. I watched in a daze as he sat in the driver's seat, speaking white noise into his handheld radio. I dissociated as I stared at the bars that separated the front and the back seats, feeling lightheaded. I said, "What's your name?" he suddenly asked, breaking me out of my trance. "Maria," I answered, my throat dry. "Okay, Maria. We got a call from a group of people claiming they were medical workers that were imprisoned and some crazy things about demons. They claimed you freed them. Is that true?" He questioned slowly. I looked up at him in silence as I tried to get my thoughts together. Yes, I did," I answered. "All right. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. We're just going to take you back to the station to get you patched up, and then you'll have to go through questioning," he explained. I nodded weakly, rubbing my eyes. He started the car, and we began driving back to the station. The car ride was peaceful, a rare moment where I wasn't fighting for my life. I watched as the buildings flashed by in a blur, the clouds moving slowly. I couldn't believe it was finally over. I could breathe. I felt safe. "Do you have any family we can contact?" he suddenly asked. I turned to him, thinking of a way to answer that question. Family? I killed my entire family. I thought about my mom's side of the family, people I hadn't spoke to in years. Would they even remember me? Or take me in? Well, here's to hoping they aren't cannibals or demons.